lack of protest and the lack of rage against what has happened in recent years, I think it's very demoralizing, actually, because what has happened to our citizenry? What has happened to a sense of justice? What has happened to fighting for the underdog, the guy at the bottom of the rung? Why have we become what we have become? We have the wealth to provide that to our citizens here. We have plenty of real wealth to, have universal health care.
This is Brian Clammer, and you're listening to 90.1 FM KKFI, Kansas City Community Radio.
Hello and welcome to Tell Somebody. Tell Somebody is a locally produced public affairs program airing weekly on 90.1 FM, streaming at www.kkfi.org, and podcasting via the iTunes Store, or find links to past shows at www.tellsomebody.us. The views and opinions expressed on Tell Somebody are those of the hosts and guests and do not necessarily reflect those of the station or anybody else involved with it. If you have any questions or comments on the show, send an email to mail@tellsomebody.us. This is Tom Clammer. It's good to be back after a week off. I was in Colorado for a few days and just returning last week with Tell Somebody left in the very capable hands of Nilüfer Movahed. So big thanks to her for that. And I hope you tuned in last Tuesday and were able to hear a fascinating discussion about current events in Iran. Nilüfer was speaking with an Iranian-Canadian blogger. And if you missed that show, you can hear it online. You can download an MP3 of the show, www.tellsomebody.us. And of course, you can hear Nilüfer every Sunday, 3 to 5 p.m. on 90.1 FM KKFI, streaming live around the world at kkfi.org on Sabah and Sayeh. And I believe this Sunday, she's going to feature Iranian music from the east and west coast of the United States that has been inspired by recent events in Iran. A little more on Iran coming up, among other subjects, from another source. Alternative radio, heard Wednesday mornings at 9 o'clock here on KKFI, is headquartered in Boulder, Colorado. And last week I drove up to Boulder and met with Alternative Radio founder and host David Barsamian. Besides on Alternative Radio, Barsamian has been heard very recently on KKFI on Grit Radio with Laura Flanders, heard every Thursday morning here, and on Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting's Counterspin, heard on KKFI on Monday mornings. In a June article about Barsamian's keynote appearance at a Canadian media conference, a Canadian news site, www.our.ca, wrote that, dating back to the 1980s, Alternative Radio, founded by Armenian-American journalist and author David Barsamian, has been a shining example of an independent media initiative that wields international scope while maintaining fierce independence and strong ties to social movements. And the article quotes Barsamian as saying, radio is uniquely positioned to deliver intellectual content, particularly because the listener is not distracted by the image, as in TV or on the internet, says Barsamian. I think that for ideas and serious talk, radio is the singular medium that can offer a real ability for listeners to delve into the profound issues of our time. So, before moving on to Afghanistan, Pakistan, and the media in general, I asked Barsamian to talk a bit about Iran. This is Tom Klamer, and I am sitting down with founder and host of Alternative Radio, David Barsamian. David Barsamian, welcome to Tell Somebody.
Hey, tell somebody.
All right.
Happy to be on.
Glad to have you. So, do you want to start with a little bit about Iran, with things that are going on currently there?
Well, the current upheaval in Iran was triggered by the June 12th election in that country and the results which were contested by some of the candidates, particularly Mir Hussein Mousavi. Mir Hussein Mousavi is a former Iranian prime minister during the 1980s. He's one of the stalwarts of the Islamic Revolution, not someone you could call, an agent of American or British imperialism. Hardly the case. Iran has changed very dramatically in the last 30 years. For example, and these I think are important things for your listeners to know. First of all, 70% of the population is under 30 years of age. Iran is a country of 70 million people. What does that mean? It means no one has any memory of the Shah, of the Islamic Revolution. Even Ayatollah Khomeini, who is the architect of the Islamic Revolution, is just a photo on some wall or in some government buildings. So there's no memory of the Islamic Revolution. And so this is a very restless population, and it's very, as I said, very young and well educated. Women's literacy under the Shah was under 30%. Since the Islamic Revolution, it's tripled. 90% of women in Iran are literate. 65% of all university and college students are women. So women are highly educated, yet they occupy a sliver of the workforce because of misogyny, because of patriarchy, because of very strict code when it comes to women. And so this uprising, yes, could be triggered, we can say, by the election, but there's other things going on underneath. You have very high unemployment. You have 25 to 30% inflation. You have rents for homes are extremely high, as well as land. So there's an enormous economic pressure. And don't forget, Iran has been under economic sanctions and boycotts led by the United States primarily. There's even shortages of gasoline. Now, this might strike you and your listeners as astonishing. I mean, how could a country with the second largest known oil reserves in the world have, cars queuing up and waiting for, long periods of time to get gasoline? Well, what happened was that during the Iran-Iraq war, when the U.S. was wholeheartedly supporting Saddam Hussein in that 8-year war, Saddam Hussein destroyed most of Iran's refining capacity. So after the war, it never rebuilt it because it felt it was too expensive, and oil revenues would more than offset any costs of importing refined gasoline. Iran also has the second largest natural gas reserves after Russia. It has the second largest oil reserves after Saudi Arabia. It recently signed a deal with neighboring Pakistan to deliver natural gas to that energy-hungry neighboring country. So another thing, particularly in regard to women, because I think this uprising, which has now brought in very mainstream establishment figures, including Rafsanjani, a former president of Iran in the 1980s, including Mohammad Khatami, who was the president of Iran from 1997 till 2005. They are now all in opposition to the ruling clique. Iran has a very complicated system of governance. At the bottom is the electorate. People who vote, turn out and vote as they did in fairly large numbers in the June 12th election. They vote for whom? They vote for the president, they vote for the Majlis, which is the Iranian parliament, like our Congress, and they also vote for something called the Assembly of Experts. This is an 86-person group of clerics that can dismiss the supreme leader. I'll come to the supreme leader. Now, above this tier of bottom, you have the electorate. Above that's the president, the parliament, and the Assembly of Experts. Then you have the Guardian Council. The Guardian Council can nullify and make void any legislation passed by the parliament. And it can certify the results of any election. It can nullify and certify the results of any election. And above the Guardian Council is the supreme leader. Now, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad is the president of Iran. He was first elected in 2005. He seems to have been re-elected in June, although that is being contested because of reports of irregularities. And I don't have to remind Americans that we are not unfamiliar with rigged elections and stolen votes. You just have to go back to 2004 and 2000 to see that, elections are not always what they seem to be here in the heartland of democracy, the United States. Ahmadinejad is the son of a blacksmith. He comes from very humble working class origins, and he has used his class background effectively to mobilize a political constituency for him. That he is with the common man. He doesn't, ride around in a Rolls Royce. He doesn't live in some palace. He lives very, very simply. He doesn't wear fancy suits, from Paris. Very ordinary type of clothes. He has managed to attract working class support inside of Iran. He is also, another thing that has attracted him to a lot of Iranians is that he was a member of he fought in the Iran-Iraq War. So he's a veteran. He was a member of the Revolutionary Guards, which is a very important militia that is answerable only to the supreme leader. There are two informal militias that have been much in the news. One is called the Revolutionary Guards. It's the Pastaran in Farsi. And the other is the Basij, B-A-S-E-E-J. They are the kind of shock troops of the Islamic Republic. They're the ones that you may have seen beating people in the streets with truncheons, and roughing people up. And
are they the ones alleged to have shot that woman that's become something of an icon? Or
yes. Neda Agha Sultan was a 26-year-old Iranian woman who apparently was shot by one of these militia members, and she has become, because of the power of YouTube and Facebook and tweeters, she has become kind of the face of the opposition. How could the regime kill this lovely, innocent, beautiful young woman? And so Ahmadinejad, to finish with him, is also a fundamentalist. He supports fervently the idea that Iran is a Islamic theocracy. It is organized around Shia Islam, which is the dominant religion in that country. Since the 1500s, Iran has been a Shia majority and Shia dominated society. 90% of Iranians are Shia. Neighboring Iraq is also Shia majority, 65%. But Iran is the biggest Shia country in the world. One of the things that you notice when I went to Iran, and others have commented on this, is that there's something called the morality police that roams the streets and stops girls or men and women together, if they're holding hands or necking or putting their arms around each other, or just innocently sitting and having a conversation in a park. They are accosted and they're reprimanded and publicly humiliated for, in the case of women, not honoring the Islamic code of dress, of touching men and that kind of thing. And, Iranian young men and women, like young men and women everywhere, hormones are not geographically coded. They have the same hormones that we do. They want to have relations. They want to have girlfriends and boyfriends. They want to drink. They want to smoke weed. They want to hang out. They want to party late into the night. They want to listen to music. They want to dance. It's perfectly normal. The regime has driven all of this underground. It's not to say it doesn't happen, but it can't happen in a free and unimpeded way. So all of these things, including the economic issues of inflation, unemployment, high rents, high land prices, all of these things come forward on June 12th. So it's not just the election. The election was the spark that triggered all of this anxiety, antipathy, antagonism toward which I think it would be fair to say is a fairly repressive fundamentalist state.
Ahmadinejad versus the main opponent who all the demonstrations seem to be focused on. A lot of us over here seem to have the idea of good guy, bad guy, and this is like a radical reformer. It's not quite like that, is it?
It's not the case at all. Musawi, as I said, is one of the stalwarts of the Islamic revolution. He wants reform. He wants that revolution to survive, but to fine-tune itself, to adjust to the new realities of Iranian society, particularly the ones I've described to you, the demographic realities, the fact that women are literate, that they're educated, that they want a greater place in Iranian economic and cultural and political life. You'll notice that there are no prominent women in the Islamic Republic's political governance structure. And when Ahmadinejad was elected in 2005, one of the first things he did was sack women who were in prominent positions. For example, the 2003 Nobel Prize winner of Iran, Shirin Ebadi, she was a prominent judge. She was fired. Musawi's wife, Zehra Renaward, who's a prominent artist and an academic, she lost her job. She was the chancellor of a women's university. And when I was in Iran, I talked to other academics, men and women, who lost their jobs in a kind of political purge. What was their crime? Well, in the case of women, it's their gender. But in the case of men who were fired, they were seen as not being sufficiently loyal to the Islamic Republic.
I want to sort of back up a bit, but also with an eye to the current situation. On this show, talked numerous times with Ray McGovern and Scott Ritter, who's been on the show, and others have written and talked about they thought Bush was going to attack Iran. Your book, Targeting Iran with Noam Chomsky et al., I was just looking at the back cover of that a bit again today, seemed to be warning that this could happen and Americans needed to be educated on some of these issues. Was that crying wolf because it didn't happen, or did it not happen because enough people in certain places were warning against it and kept it from happening? Could it still happen? There's still talk from the right about we can't allow Iran to have nuclear weapons. And why is it important for the John Q. public to be a little better educated about this than most of us are these days?
Well, let me cite a founding father, Thomas Jefferson, one of the great heroes of the American Revolution. He said if people are inattentive, that's the word he used, inattentive. If people are inattentive to what is going on in the public sphere, then the wolves will take over. That is, the politicians will do what they want, and the military-industrial complex will do what it wants. I think, not to flatter myself or my book as being pivotal, I think that book and many other interventions in the public sphere, in media and in other areas, was, I think, instrumental in raising the cost so high that the Bush administration, even though it was thinking about attacking Iran, decided to back off. And mind you, there are other factors at work here. Afghanistan is spinning out of control. Iraq continues to be a major problem. And the military itself was representing to Bush and Cheney and to Rice that the United States could not afford to open up yet another front, because I think they understood rightly that if the United States were to attack Iran is not a banana republic. It's not a punching bag or a piñata that you can just bomb and it's not going to do anything. It's going to fight back. It has allies in Iraq, which is on one of its borders. It has allies in Afghanistan. It can have, it has many instruments with which to inflict enormous damage on the United States. So that threat of war, which was real, I don't think, we were pulling that out of the hat, because people like Kristol and Krauthammer in the right-wing corporate media were openly calling for war against Iran. That whole thing receded. But again today, there is again talk that, maybe we'll let the Israelis do it. Have the Israelis as a proxy to bomb Iran. I think this would be, have catastrophic outcomes in the region, and it would also arrest any chance for reform and liberalization in Iran. When I was in Iran, and other people have confirmed this and have said the exact same thing, every time Washington ratcheted up its anti-Iranian axis of evil rhetoric, the screws were turned on in Iran. They paid the price. The liberals, reformers, they were arrested. The government would say, see, they're in cahoots with Washington. Washington is insulting us, humiliating the Iranian nation. These are agents of that. They're promoting these kinds of things. So it's still a possibility that there may be military action against Iran. How politically the current situation is going to play out is not at all clear. There seems to be, in fact, I can remove the conditional. There is a major rift in the ruling clerics. I mean, again, this is like going into Byzantium Orthodox Christianity, or the early Roman Catholic Church. You have all these cardinals and popes and bishops, and they've got their turfs, they've got their constituencies, they've got their little power bases, and for the first, at least on the surface, the first 30 years of the Islamic Republic, the clerics, the theocratic establishment was fairly united. Now there's a major break. There's a group of clerics that wants to see some relaxation in the severity of Islamic law in Iran, the way it is applied in everyday life. The way I described it, women being stopped in the street and being humiliated for not dressing properly, for showing a wrist or, some hair that is too long, it's not covered, or an ankle is showing perhaps, something like this. People don't like that. And, and that would make sense. I don't think, Americans wouldn't like that. KKFI listeners would not enjoy having dress codes imposed on them. There's that aspect. That's on a cultural level. There's also on the political economic level that they don't enjoy this group that's now breaking with Khamenei, not to be confused with Khomeini. There's just one vowel difference there. They don't enjoy Iran's pariah status. That is, it's seen as an outlaw state. They would like Iran to be in the community of nations because, they're proud of Iran and they have reason to be proud. It has 5,000 years of history. It has enormous cultural richness, poetry, music, architecture, acumen, carpets, etc. And so they would like Iran to be to have some kind of normal relations with the rest of the world. They would like more economic activity in order to alleviate some of the, deleterious economic situations inside of the country. So right now there's a major cleavage in the ruling clique in Iran. Now, I think so far Obama has very carefully calibrated the U.S. response to the upheavals in Iran, knowing full well if he uses inflammatory rhetoric that will play right into the hands of the ruling clique there, Ayatollah Khamenei and the president Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. So I think he's been very measured. Of course, there's been hysterical outpourings from the radical right who, want to proclaim jihad and want, some major U.S. Intervention. But I think that would be a serious error. And that's not what the Iranians want. And I've talked to Iranians. They want the U.S. to stay the hell out of this. They see it's an internal struggle now for power and the future of the Islamic Republic, whether it will remain an Islamic Republic. Maybe it will evolve into something that is not theocratic. This is not clear at this moment. In what way is this going to evolve? What kind of turns it's going to take?
Obama's response in rhetoric regarding Iran seems quite sensible, despite protestations from the extreme right. But pulling back and looking at Pakistan and Afghanistan doesn't seem to be enough of a departure from the Bush administration. You've been fairly recently to Pakistan, I know, and we still have these drone flights run like video games from hundreds or thousands of miles away. Maybe there is some positive side to who they get with those, but do they have any appreciation for the downside in the PR war of what that does when civilians are killed with that, or just what anybody would think about these silent things running around above their heads?
There's a lot of misinformation and disinformation about Pakistan, about Afghanistan, about the Taliban, who they are, about Al Qaeda, who they are, and maybe we can take a few minutes to sort these things out because it's very complicated. The United States invaded Afghanistan in the wake of the September 11th attacks on New York and Washington in early October 2001. We're now going into the 9th year of this ongoing occupation with no end in sight. Obama has not only continued the Bush policy, he's extended it. He's doubled the number of troops in Afghanistan. U.S. troop strength will reach 68,000 by the end of the year. He has appointed a former general as the new U.S. ambassador to Kabul, Eikenberry. This is very disturbing because, at least for people of my generation, it reminds me of when General Maxwell Taylor was appointed ambassador to Saigon by Lyndon Johnson. To me, that indicated then, and this indicates now, that the political, diplomatic effort is being subordinated to the military one. Another thing Obama did, which I found very disturbing, was appointing Bob Gates, actually continuing him as the defense secretary. He is the Bush-appointed defense secretary who succeeded Rumsfeld in late 2006. Gates was Bill Cobey's deputy during the 1980s. Bill Cobey was the head of the CIA. Bill Cobey, under orders from Reagan, was responsible for funneling billions of dollars into Pakistan and Afghanistan to train and arm the jihadis, the mujahideen, then the Islamic fundamentalists, some very extreme characters like Gulbuddin Hekmatyar and Jalaluddin Haqqani, who are still around today, Abdul Rasuf and others. And so he was head up to his neck in that particular operation, which of course, has had cataclysmic consequences for Pakistan, for Afghanistan, for the United States. He was also involved in the Iran-Contra scandal, where weapons were being sent to the Ayatollah, our so-called enemy, via Israel and Saudi Arabia, in order to gain the release of U.S. hostages being held in Lebanon. That was, another one of the, I would say, lowlights of the Reagan period. None of this is ever mentioned in retrospects of Reagan. He's regarded as some kind of, hallowed saint. And Obama recently participated in a ceremony in the Capitol where a statue of Reagan was unveiled, and he had very flattering things to say about him. But let me leave that aside. The other important decision Obama has made vis-a-vis Afghanistan is to appoint Stanley McChrystal as the commander-in-chief of the Afghan war. Who is Stanley McChrystal? Well, when he was in Afghanistan before, he was involved in the cover-up of the Pat Tillman scandal. Pat Tillman, the Arizona Cardinal NFL football star, who after September 11th, positively motivated by feelings of patriotism, dropped his NFL career. He could have made, tons of money, and joins the military. He is, we are told by the Pentagon, killed in a firefight with the Taliban, hand-to-hand combat. He's awarded a Silver Star, and he's a national hero.
You made it sound like the climatic scene of a John Wayne movie. I mean, the truth is he's a hero enough for what you just said.
There was a slight problem with this script. I don't know who wrote it, but it was completely fabricated. In fact, Tillman was killed tragically by his own troops, his own comrades in friendly fire. And the only reason this ever came out was because of the persistent investigations of his own family who smelled the rat, and the fact that some members of his unit, leaked information that, there was no firefight, it was friendly fire. This, was right on the heels of the Jessica Lynch fiasco in Iraq the year before. The same kind of Pentagon manufactured heroism where we're all supposed to cheer, in this case for a slight West Virginia young woman who engaged Iraqis in fearsome combat and then was raped by Iraqis, was not given proper medical care, was humiliated and debased, and etc., etc. Again, totally manufactured, a completely made-up story. We know from her own words that she didn't even fire her weapon, that she was treated very well by the Iraqis. She was never harmed in any way. She was given the best medical attention that was available in that particular hospital. And the Iraqis made every effort to return her to her unit, to the American soldiers. And when they tried to do that, they were fired upon. So they went back. So, this kind of propaganda it's a handmaiden to war. It's part and parcel of winning the home front, creating stories, feel-good stories about, American heroes, and, so that we'll support these wars. Now, Afghanistan now is seeing a huge increase in violence. Afghanistan has a history of resisting foreign invaders. Afghanistan is a multi-ethnic, multicultural, multilingual society. The largest group is Pashtun, but there are also Uzbeks, Tajiks, Baluch, Hazaras, and other groups, Nuristani, for example. Some of them speak different languages. Most of them are Sunnis, but there is a Shia minority in Afghanistan. Left to their own devices, they may in fact quarrel among themselves. But when there's an outside force invading and occupying their country, this is the Afghan history, and it's good to know a little history, because from the past we may learn some things which will reveal what will happen in the future. From Alexander the Great, down to the British Empire, down to the Soviet Union, and now again with the Americans thinking that they can re-engineer Afghan society to make it a mirror image of some kind of Western democracy. I mean, that even, enunciating that is so ludicrous. I mean, this is a highly conservative, tradition-bound, Islamic fundamentalist culture. They're not interested in the things that we are interested in, and that we think, because of our omniscience and our omnipotence, is good for them. We should ask them what they would like. It's quite different from what we think is good for them. But that's the arrogance of power. That's the hubris of empire. That's the feeling that, everything that we invent is good for other people, and our culture is the model to follow. So historically, they have always resisted invaders. Take the case of the British, the great empire that we replaced in 1945. On 3 separate occasions, they invaded Afghanistan. They were totally unsuccessful in subduing the Afghans. In fact, in one of the earliest ones, in 1842, out of 16,000 British troops that invaded Afghanistan from then British India, only 1 survived. They let 1 person live to tell the tale of Afghan ferocity and resistance. So, and imagine now, like the Soviet Union, the American troops are overwhelmingly white, overwhelmingly Christian. They can't speak the languages. They have no cultural sensitivity. They know very little about Islam, Muslim traditions, Islamic history. They're coming from 10,000 miles away, implanted there. What do you think the average Afghan, I mean, I'm not saying there aren't collaborators. There are people like Hamid Karzai, who's our DM. DM was our puppet in Saigon, and Karzai is our puppet in Kabul, and he's up for election in August of 2009. People don't like it. People don't like being occupied. They don't like being searched. They don't like being yelled at in a language they can't understand. They don't like being accosted in the street and asked for ID. They don't like their homes being broken down in the middle of the night. They don't like their women being humiliated, as we would not like. It doesn't make them unique in any way. These are very unpleasant experiences. And in neighboring Pakistan, a country of 200 million people, that throughout its history, the U.S. has supported one military dictator or regime after another, starting with Ayub Khan, then Yahya Khan, Zia-ul-Haq, Pervez Musharraf, and the current civilian buffoon, Asif Ali Zardari. I call him a buffoon because he has no political traction in the country. The only reason he's the head of Pakistan is because he's the widower of Benazir Bhutto, who was assassinated in December of 2007. Asif Ali Zardari, upon whom we are betting the house in Pakistan, is a known crook. During his wife's first tenure as Prime Minister, he was known as Mr. 10%. 10% of all contracts, he was taking a cut. All government revenues, he was getting a piece of that. During Benazir's second tenure as Prime Minister from 1993 to 96, I kind of make this joke, making adjustments for inflation, he became Mr. 20%, because prices had gone up, so he needed a bigger cut. He's been implicated in murder. He's has been imprisoned in Pakistan. And this is the democratic face that we are supporting. He's deeply unpopular. The United States is also very unpopular in Pakistan because of these drone attacks that you mentioned, that inconveniently land on mosques, schools, people's homes, wedding parties. It seems the U.S. is really, cornered the market on bombing wedding parties. I don't know why, but there is an understanding to this. In that culture there in Pakistan and Afghanistan, men, if they have guns, during important celebrations, shoot them off. So the satellites pick this up. They think it's some military, it must be the terrorists, it must be Taliban, it must be Al-Qaeda. And they think that's what's going on. And there's, there are all these pickups there. And, everybody knows the Taliban loves to ride around in Toyota pickups. And so they mistakenly bomb villages. They mistakenly bomb wedding parties and the like. And this has a huge backlash. Very, very unpopular. And then you have the corporate media here, like the New York Times, just, recently saying these attacks cause resentment among Afghans. Imagine that. How dare they feel resentment? They should be welcoming our bombs. They should be welcoming being occupied and being invaded. And then in Pakistan, the same kind of thing. And this was on World Focus, a TV program on public television, on PBS. It's out of New York. The journalist said these drone attacks upset Pakistanis, and they're very controversial. Gee, again I'm thinking, you don't like your mosque being bombed, you don't like your school being bombed, your family being blown to smithereens.
Collateral damage, they don't see the big
collateral
picture
damage, yes.
Of the important issues, I guess.
So I think Obama is digging a big hole for himself, and he's not going to be able to get out, because they have no awareness of the tremendous amount of resentment, real resentment, toward outside invaders and occupiers. And in Afghanistan in particular, I think he is now, by escalating the war, he is creating, I think, a huge disaster for himself, the American military, and sadly, most of all, for the Afghan people, who are going to die in large numbers.
We're talking with David Barsamian of Alternative Radio here in Boulder, and regular listeners to KKFI who have been listening to Alternative Radio for some time I think would agree with me that some of the most compelling radio you want to hear is in this body of work that you've been doing for some time. You've known prominently for interviews with Noam Chomsky, with you have things with Vandana Shiva, sometimes interviews, sometimes speeches, just some really compelling stuff. Anything you want to tell us about how alternative radio came to be, what you see for it in the future, and put this in the picture of this whole media situation we have these days with the newspaper advertising model falling apart and Fox dominating the cable airwaves, and anything you have to say on all of that.
Well, I started alternative radio a few blocks from here, in a home I was living in. I did everything. I answered the phone. It was the era of cassettes. I was, making the recordings, sending them out to stations, making dubs, answering listener phone calls directly. It was all out of my home. I did it because I was fed up with the corporate media and wanted to do something radical. I wanted to intervene in a concrete way. And I had the great good fortune of very early linking up with people like Noam Chomsky, whom you mentioned, but also Iqbal Ahmed, Edward Said, Tariq Ali, Arundhati Roy. My parents are from the Middle East. I'm of Armenian background. They met in Beirut and got married there and came to New York in 1921. I was born in New York, so I had that background, and I also studied in India. I studied sitar for a number of years in India. So I have a great kind of cultural attachment to what is called South Asia, the Indian subcontinent, which includes, Bangladesh and Nepal, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, and one could say Afghanistan, as well as the Middle East, which I think is more accurately should be described as West Asia, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Iran, where I've been, a couple of times, Turkey and that area. So I've always tried to bring voices from regions of the globe where the U.S. has been involved, and then these are critical voices of dissent, intellectuals, artists. For example, if people had been listening to alternative radio over the last just 2 or 3 or 4 years, whatever I've said about Pakistan would not come as news, because I have been reporting on Pakistan assiduously as I've been going there, 4, 5, 6, 7 times in recent years, talking to people like Fatima Bhutto, who is a critic of Benazir Bhutto, who's her aunt, and also of Asif Ali Zardari, describing him as a corrupt, venal politician who's only interested in enriching himself and his cronies, not someone who cares about Pakistan and or the well-being of that country. Another voice, for example, that I was really proud to bring to the airwaves was Tahira Abdullah, head of the Women's Action Forum of Pakistan. Now, when you hear Pakistan, you're thinking Stone Age, repression of women. There are also very dynamic women there who are out, in the front lines, protesting discrimination, contesting misogyny, fighting patriarchy, trying to change the juridical code. I mean, a lot of these things are enshrined in law. So fighting the law and overturning legislation that discriminates against women in terms of property rights, let's say, for example, voting, polygamy, which is allowed for men but not for women, for example, divorce, those kinds of issues. That was one of the programs I was really proud of doing. I interviewed someone right on the Afghan border, a very prominent journalist, Rahimullah Yusufzai, who then, this is a couple of years ago, was warning that any expansion of military action, be it in Pakistan or in neighboring Afghanistan, would have very serious consequences. It would be a recruiting bugle call for the jihad. It would actually inflame tensions rather than alleviate them. He kind of put it this way. He said, if you have a fire, and he acknowledged there's a smoldering fire, because there's resentment. There's a feudal economic structure. There are large landowners who control literally serfs, bonded labor, and they're indebted. Literally, they inherit debt from their grandparents and parents, and they spend the rest of their lives trying to work off the debt. They can't do it. It's a very feudal culture, but you'll notice I haven't used the word tribal, which to me reeks of colonialism. And when you say tribes here, wild tribes, savage tribes, immediately it evokes the 19th century American West and those kind of Ronald Reagan, John Wayne movies of, innocent, European and American settlers heading west in, wagon trains and being assaulted by ferocious and savage Indians, who don't understand the magnificent, who don't understand how wonderful it is that, the Europeans and Western civilization is going to destroy them and their lives. And they never, of course, accepted that. So he said, so while there is a Rahimullah Yousafzai, there's a smoldering fire. What do you do with a smoldering fire if you want to put it out? You put water on it. Or you get cloth and you dampen it down. But what are the Americans doing, he said? They're putting gasoline on it. So the fire has now, enveloped two countries. The war in Afghanistan has extended into Pakistan. And what is the end game? What does the Obama administration want to do in that part of the world? Does it want to re-engineer the culture? Does it want to create a Denmark or a Canada? Or what? I think it's extremely foolish, extremely dangerous. The economy here is in extremely weak. The economy is in an extremely weak state. We're spending hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars on wars of occupation with no end in sight. Who benefits from this? Well, there are people who benefit. Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, General Dynamics, General Electric, Raytheon, Honeywell, United Technologies. They do really well. War does pay big dividends if you are a war manufacturer of weapons and war material. But if you don't have health care, if you've just lost your job, if you've just had your home foreclosed, if you've had to, move in with your parents because you can't afford rent, and you're a 40-year-old man married with children, if you can't send your kids to school because tuition prices are skyrocketing, might some of that money be better spent here in the United States? And I would really ask people who call themselves conservatives to think about this. The huge amount of money being siphoned off, the little fat that we have in our economy is all being drained to the Pentagon. Almost $1 trillion is what the military budget is. I mean, that's still, I know we're now in the age of trillions, but that ain't chump change.
That doesn't bother conservatives. Now, 20 cents to a welfare mom or a school
That's
lunch.
Immoral and corrupt. And you'll get lectures about how this makes this person, weak. It doesn't build moral character. We're a welfare state.
I come from Missouri, and I'm just so proud. One of our state legislators has been featured on the Colbert Report. She was speaking against some extended school lunch program for the summer for hungry children because she said hunger can be a positive motivating factor for these kids. So I guess they're supposed to learn to pull the bootstraps from them pretty quick. It's amazing.
I mean, what's happened to the American economy, again, using Vietnam-era terminology that might be familiar to some of your listeners, it's been carpet-bombed. Mm-hmm. It's been stripped. It's been outsourced and downsized and riffed. The banking system, a lot of wealth has been offshored as well. I mean, within the lifetime of most of the people listening to this program, they've seen the United States become a deindustrialized state, except for weapons. There is one area where the U.S. maintains its supremacy, and that is in weaponry, in weapons of mass destruction. But in terms of manufacturing power, the U.S. is now receding in a very dramatic way. And we feel, that the economy's become like a free fire zone, where things are, being shipped out of the country, whole industries, with unions have been undermined, legislation has been passed which makes it very difficult for unions to organize. They've been vilified in the culture, as corrupt, as opposed to, let's say, banks and Wall Street financiers. They're not corrupt. Hello? Yeah. And things like that. And it seems like the population is in a gigantic, our citizenry is in a gigantic strategic hamlet. We're surrounded by barbed wire and we can't get out.
And as you suggested earlier, it doesn't seem like a lot of us are very upset about it.
The lack of protest and the lack of rage against what has happened in recent years, I think it's very demoralizing, actually. Because what has happened to our citizenry? What has happened to a sense of justice? What has happened to, fighting for the underdog, the guy at the bottom of the rung? Why have we become what we have become?
That's Alternative Radio host and founder David Barsamian, recorded last week at his home in Boulder, Colorado. And while I was with Barsamian, he handed me a couple of copies of the current issue of Yes Magazine, which features a portion of an interview he did in India with Vandana Shiva. They talk about Gandhi for today's world. I'll get a link to that article in Yes Magazine up on www.tellsomebody.us. And David tells me you can hear the entire interview tomorrow morning right here on KKFI on Alternative Radio, right after Democracy Now! That's about it for this week's show. If you have any comments or questions, send an email to mail@tellsomebody.us. Stay tuned for A Taste of Tejano with Manny and Viviana, and I'll see you next week.